Sonoma Valley, California, is one of the most agriculturally productive regions in the United States. It yields vast amounts of hops, grapes, prunes, apples, dairy, and poultry products annually. This success is due to its large areas of fertile land and a reliable supply of quality irrigation water. Besides its vineyards and wineries, Sonoma seems like a peaceful paradise. However, in the early 1970s, a series of grim events unfolded in the hills near Santa Rosa, Sonoma's largest city, turning this beautiful area into a nightmare. On February 4, 1972, two middle school friends, Marie-Louise Sterling and Yvonne Lisa Weber, both 12 years old, were last seen hitchhiking along Guerneville Road, just northeast of Santa Rosa. After they didn't return home that night, their parents pleaded with local authorities to find them. Tragically, their bodies were found on December 28th, not far from Franz Valley Road. Near the scene, investigators discovered a single earring, orange beads, and a gold cross necklace. Due to the condition of the skeletal remains, the cause of death couldn't be determined. Just a month later, on March 4, 1972, 19-year-old art student Kim Wendy Allen accepted a ride from two men. They last saw her hitchhiking to school around 5:20 p.m., carrying a large wooden soy barrel with Chinese characters painted on it. Her body was found the next day, dumped in a creek bed. The two men who gave her a ride were questioned but cleared as suspects after one passed a polygraph test. These murders were part of a disturbing pattern of hitchhiker killings, but only a few seemed to follow the same method. One case in particular had a chilling twist. Carolyn Nadine Davis, 14, ran away from her home near Anderson in Shasta County on February 6, 1973. On July 15th, after her grandmother dropped her off at the Garberville post office, Carolyn was last seen hitchhiking near a highway in Garberville. Her body was found on July 31st, not far from where Sterling and Weber's remains had been discovered. This time, the coroner determined the cause of death: strychnine poisoning, likely 10 to 14 days before her body was found. Near her body, a witchcraft symbol was discovered, suggesting deeper, more unsettling elements at play. Investigators have connected at least 8 other unsolved murders of young women to this unknown killer, but no convictions have ever been made. Despite this, some theories about the killer's identity have surfaced over the years. One theory involved Kenneth Bianchi and Angelo Buono Jr., the infamous hillside stranglers of Los Angeles. These killers were responsible for strangling and dumping the bodies of escorts in the hills northeast of Los Angeles in 1977. However, despite the similarities, there wasn't enough evidence to link Bianchi and Buono to the Sonoma murders. Another suspect was Frederick Manali, a 41-year-old creative writing teacher at Santa Rosa Junior College. In August 1976, Manali died in a car crash on Highway 12. During the investigation, police found disturbing drawings in his possession depicting violent, sadomasochistic scenes involving young women. One of the women in his sketches was identified as Kim Wendy Allen, the second victim in the hitchhiker killings. However, despite searches of his home, no solid evidence connected Manali to the murders. Ted Bundy, one of the most notorious serial killers, was also suspected of being the Sonoma hitchhiker killer due to similarities in the crimes. Bundy was known for targeting young women in several states, including Washington, Colorado, Utah, and Idaho. He was even in nearby Marin County at the time. However, detectives ruled Bundy out in the 1970s and again in 1989, thanks to detailed credit card records showing he was in Washington state during some of the disappearances. Another possible suspect was the Zodiac Killer. Investigators explored this theory due to a symbol found near the body of one victim that resembled a symbol used by the Zodiac Killer in his letters. The Zodiac Killer had written to the San Francisco Chronicle in 1969, stating he planned to change his method to confuse detectives. Despite the similarities, no solid link was ever made. Lastly, some believed Arthur Lee Allen, a prime suspect in the Zodiac case, might be responsible for the hitchhiker murders. Allen lived in a mobile home in Santa Rosa at the time of the killings and had a history of inappropriate behavior with children. He was arrested in 1974 for molesting a young boy and spent several years in prison. Investigators also noted that chipmunk hairs were found on the bodies of several victims, and Allen had been studying that particular species. However, Allen's DNA did not match samples found on Zodiac killer letters, and other forensic evidence failed to connect him to the murders. Despite the various theories, the question remains unanswered. Who was responsible for the brutal hitchhiker murders in Sonoma County? Even 50 years later, the mystery endures, leaving families and investigators searching for answers. Back in 2010, I tried to plan a camping trip for myself and a few buddies. All spring, they had been talking about how cool it would be if we went camping together. Just a bunch of guys, no phones, just enjoying nature and living in the moment. But as the date got closer, one by one, all four of them backed out, each with a different excuse for why they couldn't come. I was pretty bummed since I had been really excited for an adventure. I had also spent what felt like a lot of money at the time on all the gear and clothes I thought I'd need. I was disappointed that the trip was about to fall through. Then I had an idea. Why not go alone? We had planned to go in mid-July, which is the best time to camp in the far northeast. It was either stick to the plan or wait another year. So, I packed up my stuff and, on the day we were supposed to leave, I headed out solo for a few days of camping at Lakeside National Park. During the 3 days I was there, I had an amazing time. I had worried that I might regret going alone, thinking I'd be bored out of my mind, but I couldn't have been more wrong. Between setting up camp, gathering firewood, setting up bear alarms, and keeping the fire going, I didn't have a free moment until the sun went down. And once it did, I wasn't exactly in the mood to relax. Being in the woods at night is freaky, especially since it was my first time camping alone in a decade. I had to get used to it quickly if I wanted any sleep. After a while, I adjusted to the sounds of the forest at night. There's only so many times you can replay scenes from the Blair Witch Project in your head before it loses its effect, you know? So by the second and third nights, I was able to get some decent sleep. But on the last night of my trip, I woke up in the middle of the night feeling extremely uncomfortable. There's no polite way to say this, so I'll just be blunt. I hadn't gone to the bathroom in 3 days. Every time I thought about doing it, I imagined a snake sneaking up on me, making me panic and either getting messy or getting bitten. There are no venomous snakes in this part of Maine, but the thought still freaked me out enough to avoid going. However, I couldn't hold it in any longer. I got up, turned on my headlamp to its dim setting, and walked into the woods with my wet wipes. I didn't go far, but I didn't want to do my business too close to where I'd be having breakfast the next morning. I wandered for a minute or two before finding a spot near a tree, taking care of business quickly and smoothly. Well, as smoothly as you can in the woods. Just as I was about 80 or 90 feet from camp, I noticed a flashlight beam near my campsite. Seeing another person's light in the middle of the night set off alarm bells in my head. Sure, there could have been innocent reasons, but way more unsettling ones came to mind. Instead of walking back to see what the stranger wanted, I quickly turned off my headlamp and crept behind a nearby tree to watch. Now, you might be wondering why I used a dim blue light. It's because if someone blinds themselves with a bright light, it's hard for them to spot a dim blue one. That's why I was able to turn off my headlamp without being noticed. I hid behind the tree, watching as the flashlight beam moved around my camp. I couldn't make out the person clearly, but they were shining the light on various things, like they were inspecting my stuff or searching for something. Then, I saw a second flashlight, meaning there were two people now. They both wandered around my camp, shining their lights and talking to each other. I couldn't hear much, but I caught enough to realize they were looking for me specifically. One guy asked the other a question, and the reply was a bit louder. He was just here. Hearing those words sent chills down my spine. I get that people might accidentally stumble upon a campsite at night, but for them to know I had been there and to be looking for me, that was terrifying. What made it even scarier was that I had set up a few bear alarms, tripwires with noisemakers attached, and these two managed to walk right into my camp without setting off a single one. Those alarms are hard to spot even in daylight, let alone at night. I watched them for a while longer, trying to pick up what they were saying. Eventually, I heard one of them say, "We'll come back tomorrow." After that, they exchanged a few more words, turned around, and left. I stayed hidden for about 10 or 15 minutes, debating what to do. I was almost certain they were watching me from somewhere and would return if I went back to camp. I wanted to pack up my stuff and get out of there before dawn, but that would make too much noise and I'd have to use my headlamp, making me an easy target. I know it sounds like I was overthinking, but when you're stuck in the dark, not moving, and with nothing but your thoughts, everything seems more dangerous. I stayed where I was until dawn finally started to break. Once I felt safe enough, I quietly returned to my camp and quickly packed up. I didn't even bother with breakfast. I just walked straight back to my car. On my way off the island, I stopped at the visitor center and asked if any park rangers had been patrolling the campsites at night. They hadn't, and there was no reason for them to walk up to a camper's site like that. My name's Mark, and I'm a big fan from Sydney, Australia. The story I'm about to tell actually ties into your YouTube channel in an unexpected way. I met my girlfriend in June 2018, and it was her who first introduced me to your videos. I won't lie, I thought it was kind of odd at first how listening to scary stories helped her fall asleep, but over time I started to get it. Before long, we'd regularly put on a video while doing the dishes after dinner, and it became a bit of a ritual for us. In late March 2019, we were listening to one of your camping story compilations when my girlfriend suggested we visit Winton Valley, a popular spot about 4 hours outside of Sydney, known for hiking and camping. I know it sounds a little weird to listen to spooky camping stories and then decide to head to a similar location, but we weren't worried. Rural crime in Australia is pretty rare, and we didn't feel like we'd be in any danger. But, as you'll hear, things took a pretty strange turn. We drove to Winton Valley on April 2nd, 2020, after buying some new camping gear online. While scouting for a good spot to set up our tents, we came across another couple just off the trail. About 10 meters away from them was a burned-out truck and what looked like the charred remains of a tent. The couple, a young man and woman, seemed pretty shaken. The guy was pacing with his phone pressed to his ear, looking really worried. At first, I thought they had somehow set their own camp on fire, maybe by accident, but we were more concerned about making sure they were okay. As we approached, the guy hung up his phone and explained that the campsite wasn't theirs. They'd stumbled across it, just like we had, and called emergency services to report it. He pointed out that the fire seemed recent. We could still smell the burnt debris from the trail. He also mentioned seeing some fresh food lying around, which made him think it wasn't just a prank or vandalism. Since the authorities had already been contacted, my girlfriend and I figured there wasn't much else we could do. So we wished the couple well and continued on our way. Looking back, it's wild to think how casually we treated the whole situation. We just assumed it was an unfortunate accident, nothing sinister. Not long after we returned home, my girlfriend sent me a link to a news story. The burned truck and tent we had seen belonged to an elderly couple who had gone missing while camping in the area. They hadn't turned up anywhere, and authorities were now asking for information. We called the police to share what little we knew, but honestly, we didn't have much to offer. We had camped for 2 nights, but aside from encountering that young couple and seeing the burned campsite, we hadn't noticed anything unusual. For a while, we wondered if the couple we met could have been involved somehow. I mean, they were right there when we found the scene, and the guy claimed he had been talking to emergency services, but we had no way of verifying that. We mentioned them to the police when we called, but they assured us they had already spoken extensively with the person who made the report. Turns out, our suspicions were just paranoia. The couple had nothing to do with the missing people. We found out for sure about 1.5 years later when the bodies of the elderly couple were discovered. It was heartbreaking, but not entirely surprising to us. We figured the fire had been an accident, and the poor couple had likely gotten injured or lost afterward and didn't survive the elements. But then the news came out that it wasn't an accident at all. The couple had been murdered. Their truck and tent had been set on fire to destroy any evidence. The realization that we had unknowingly stumbled upon a crime scene was chilling. From what we read later, the murders had taken place just a day before we arrived. If we had gone a bit earlier, we might have even seen the couple alive, or perhaps the valley would have been busier, and things could have turned out differently. We felt awful for their family, but there was also a part of us that wanted to know the full story. What had really happened to them? Were we in any danger ourselves during those 2 nights in the valley? Was it random, or was it something personal? As it turns out, it wasn't random at all. The whole tragedy started over an argument involving a drone. The killer and the elderly couple hadn't known each other before that day. During a confrontation, the man attacked them, killing them both, and then tried to cover up the crime by setting their belongings on fire. The case was still in court when I decided to send this story your way. The killer's defense was trying to argue that the man had felt threatened, claiming the elderly man had pointed a gun at him, and he acted in self-defense. But then he admitted to burning the bodies and the scene to destroy evidence. It was disturbing to hear him try to justify what he had done. Anyway, I just wanted to share this story with you. It's insane to think that something like this could happen over something as trivial as a drone. Keep up the good work on your channel, and hopefully, this guy gets the sentence he deserves. I'm part of a volunteer search and rescue group, and every year, we participate in a late summer retreat filled with team building and bonding exercises. One of these activities includes night training, where we practice our search and rescue skills after dark. My specific role is K9 handler, which is a big reason I joined in the first place. I've always loved working with animals, but I didn't have the grades to become a vet. So, being a dog handler was the perfect blend of doing something meaningful while getting to work with dogs. Anyway, we were out on a night exercise when my dog, who's trained to locate human remains, started signaling that he picked up a scent. At the time, I was paired with a more experienced member of the team. When I looked to her for guidance, she simply said, "Let's see where this goes." Now, I know some of you might be thinking, your dog detected the scent of human remains. Why didn't you freak out? But even the most skilled cadaver dogs can be wrong sometimes. In a place like Oregon, where we get a lot of rain, scents can get mixed up and mislead the dogs. So our policy was to let the dog do its thing, and in the worst case scenario, we'd find some undiscovered remains, which, while disturbing, is part of the job. The senior team member agreed to stay on the trail while my dog and I followed the scent he picked up. We assumed it was just a false alarm, and in a few minutes he'd lose the scent and we'd get back to our planned route. But a few minutes turned into about 10, and after my dog started leading me down a steep slope, I lost my balance and took a bad fall. The next thing I knew, my chest was burning, likely from what turned out to be 2 broken ribs, and I felt blood trickling down where I'd hit my head on a rock. The first thing I did was press the emergency alert on my GPS, signaling base camp that I needed help. Then, I started calling for my dog, since I'd dropped his leash during the fall. I think the fall scared him off, or maybe he kept following the scent, thinking I was still behind him. Lying there in pain, I felt disoriented and scared. I had lost my flashlight in the fall, so I could barely see anything. I kept shouting for my dog, Brody, hoping someone from base camp was on the way. I'm not sure how long I was there before I heard footsteps getting closer. Relief washed over me, and I started to call out, "I'm here." I think I broke something, thinking it was one of the other volunteers. But when the person spoke, I immediately realized they weren't with our group. Every year we do various icebreakers, so I knew all the volunteers' voices, including the new ones. But this voice didn't belong to anyone from our team. It was a man's voice, and what he said sent a chill through me. Instead of offering help, he started talking about how many people fall into that very creek bed each year. He mentioned that at least one person dies there annually due to flash floods during the rainy season. I went from asking for help to begging for it, but he just kept talking, giving this eerie monologue about how people go missing in that area. I lost my temper and demanded to know what was wrong with him. His reply was something like, "You're not in any position to talk to me like that." At that point, I started screaming for help, which hurt my chest even more, but I didn't care. The pain was excruciating, but I was more terrified of what this man might do. Just then, I heard my dog, Brody, barking. He's part Australian Shepherd and makes these distinctive howling noises when he wants attention. As soon as Brody's barks grew louder, the man went silent and quickly retreated. A minute or two later, I heard more footsteps, this time from several people, and they had flashlights. I called out again, and soon, 2 of my fellow volunteers found me. They shined a flashlight on me and immediately started helping. The first thing I told them was about the strange man I had encountered. One of them started searching the area with their flashlight while the other asked, "Were you pushed?" They seemed worried that the man might have caused my fall. I reassured them that I wasn't pushed, but it didn't make the encounter any less frightening. The man had just been there, watching me fall and then delivering his creepy speech. My teammates stayed with me until a medic arrived with an ATV to take me back to base camp. I was then checked over at a rural clinic, where they confirmed my ribs were broken. After receiving some pain meds and being told I was stable, my teammates could finally relax. A bunch of them visited me the next morning, and I told them more about the man's unsettling behavior. A week later, after I'd been discharged from the hospital, I got a call from the senior team member who had been with me before the fall. She asked how I was recovering and then told me that the team leaders were considering moving the retreat to a new location next year. Apparently, a few other team members had reported seeing someone walking around in the dark who didn't belong to our group. After discussing it, they decided it wasn't worth risking another run-in with the strange figure. The most dangerous situation I ever found myself in happened during a solo camping trip in late June 2014. For those unfamiliar, or if you weren't in Pennsylvania at the time, the region sometimes experiences intense summer storms every few years, known as derechos. I'm not great at explaining weather phenomena, so here's a simple definition. A derecho is a widespread, long-lasting windstorm associated with fast-moving thunderstorms. It can cause damage similar to a tornado, but the destruction usually occurs in a straight line. To be classified as a derecho, the wind gusts must reach at least 58 miles per hour or higher over most of its length. For context, a weak hurricane has winds starting at around 74 miles per hour, so a derecho is basically like a small hurricane. They're dangerous, but to most people, they're just a nuisance. Now, imagine camping alone in the middle of the woods in Pennsylvania, seeing the sky darken, and realizing the wind is strong enough to uproot trees. That's when I started to get genuinely scared. Luckily, as I was searching for a safe place to set up camp that night, I came across a man-made structure. A simple concrete pavilion with just one wall. It didn't offer much protection from the wind and rain, but if a tree fell nearby, it could be the difference between life and death. However, unfortunately for me, I wasn't the only one in the forest with that idea. About an hour before sunset, with the wind still roaring through the trees, I heard a heavy thumping sound, like something large running towards the shelter. At first, I couldn't see or hear it clearly because of the storm and how the pavilion was positioned. Then, suddenly, I was barely on my feet when a black bear came charging around the corner of the shelter. The storm had clearly terrified it, which was very bad news for me. My first instinct was to scream and wave my arms around like a madman, trying to appear scarier than the storm. As you can imagine, that's easier said than done. The bear saw me, jumped back in surprise, and then ran off in the same direction it was heading. But instead of leaving, it circled around the other side of the shelter and came back from the same direction. I did the same thing I did the first time, yelling and jumping up and down. The bear ran off again, but then, once more, it looped back around. It was obvious the bear wanted to take shelter, and it was deciding whether I was worth fighting over it. The scariest part was that with each loop, it got closer and closer. After a few more rounds, I could hear its claws scraping the concrete just a few feet from me, and its frustrated huffing made it even more terrifying. As it got closer with each pass, I realized I had to back away to avoid being within striking distance. The more I backed off, the more ground I gave it until finally, the bear charged into the shelter and took a swipe at me before backing off for another loop. At that point, I grabbed my backpack and held it up like a makeshift shield. It was still heavy with most of my gear inside, so I planned to use it like a battering ram if the bear came at me again. My heart was pounding as the bear made another pass, looking like it was about to rush into the shelter for another swipe. But then, I guess the sight of me holding the backpack must have thrown it off. The way it changed my appearance must have made me look strange to the bear. It backed off and didn't come in for another attack. Instead, it let out a frustrated roar, spun around like it was confused, and then ran off the way it had come. You might think the logical thing to do at that point would be to leave the shelter immediately, since the bear could come back. But where could I go? Staying out in the woods meant risking being crushed by falling trees, but staying in the shelter meant risking another bear encounter. If I got hurt or couldn't run, the bear might catch up and cause some real damage. In the end, I decided to stay in the shelter, figuring that my backpack shield tactic might work again if needed. It might sound crazy, but I was pretty sure the bear wouldn't come back. I was, however, absolutely certain that several trees would be knocked down by the wind, and there was no way to scare one of those off by waving my backpack. That's why I chose to endure a sleepless and terrifying night in the storm. A few years back, I decided to go camping with about 10 friends at a place called Red Rock Hot Springs in eastern Nevada. It just so happened to be Friday the 13th, and the moon was full. The drive took about an hour and a half. Since I had to work the next day, I planned on taking it easy and not drinking much so I wouldn't be hungover in the morning. We arrived, picked out a nice camping spot away from most of the other campers, and started cracking open some beers. Afterward, we took a dip in the nearby hot springs, and when the sun set, we decided to go for a night walk to enjoy the mountains under the full moon and stars. By this point, it was pitch black outside, and most people had already headed back, so only a few of us ended up going on the night walk. Quick side note, the three of us who went had been microdosing mushrooms throughout the night. It wasn't too intense, though. I don't like getting too out of it and prefer staying aware of my surroundings. So there we were, me, two of my friends, and one of my friend's dogs. We were walking uphill for about 10 minutes, using our flashlights to guide the way, when we took a turn onto a side trail. Not even 3 minutes later, we heard some loud, close rustling ahead of us. We stopped in our tracks. My friend, who was leading the way, started scanning the area with his flashlight. Have you ever seen the eyes of a big cat at night? The way they glow is terrifying, especially when the cat is bigger than you. I've never been so scared in my life, and I mean that. Standing right in front of us, not far away at all, was a massive mountain lion. Instinct took over and we started slowly backing away. My friend's dog, however, decided to dart off to the right into the woods, but the mountain lion didn't go after her. Instead, it kept its glowing eyes locked on us. We kept backing up, but then we realized the dog had somehow rejoined us. So what was making noise behind us? We shone the flashlight, and sure enough, there was another mountain lion. This one seemed younger, maybe a cub. Panic set in. There was another campsite on the other side of a fence, so we did the only thing we could think of. We turned around, jumped the fence, and tore our clothes in the process. My friend even cut his leg pretty badly. So now we're in someone else's campsite on Friday the 13th, under a full moon, tripping a bit on mushrooms and completely lost. We didn't know where the campers were, but we didn't care. We got into their unlocked car and honked the horn for about a minute to scare off the mountain lions. Afterward, we yelled out, letting everyone nearby know there were cougars around and that we weren't trying to steal anything. Strangely, nobody came out to check on their campsite. My friend thought she heard someone trying to scream, but her boyfriend insisted we needed to leave the area. A part of me believed her, though I didn't hear anything myself. Either way, I was more than ready to get out of there. We found the exit to their campsite, and on the way back to ours, I said a final prayer, and I'm not even religious. Back at our camp, every rustling noise made me feel like we were being followed by those cougars. I had a full-blown panic attack in the car for about an hour. Everyone else, including the two who were with me, was back at the campfire having a good time. The next morning, I woke up with a brutal hangover, didn't show up for my shift, and ended up getting fired when we returned to town. Honestly, though, I didn't care. I was just happy to be alive. Patapsco State Park used to be one of my favorite places in the world. I grew up just outside Baltimore in a place called Woodbridge. Some of you might recognize the name, but not for the best reasons. I went to Woodbridge High School, the same school where Kevin Sage and Hannah Lee went. It's the school that became infamous due to the podcast Case Files. For those unfamiliar, Case Files was one of the first big true crime podcasts, and it told the story of how Kevin supposedly killed Hannah, his girlfriend at the time. This tragic event cast a dark cloud over Woodbridge, and Baltimore's reputation had already taken a hit after The Wire came out. Back in my last year of middle school, I used to love both places and spent more time than I'd like to admit defending them in online game lobbies. But there came a day when I could no longer defend Baltimore or the area. That was the same day I decided never to go back to Patapsco State Park again. In the summer of 2015, my girlfriend and I decided to visit the park. Patapsco has several camping spots, each with its own table and fire ring. I had spent most of my life hiking and camping there, which is why it was one of my favorite places, and I knew the park like the back of my hand. I also knew one of the most secluded and beautiful hiking spots was between the river and the train tracks. There's a narrow, almost untouched trail that runs along the river. If no trains passed by, it felt like something straight out of a storybook. I was excited to show this spot to my girlfriend, figuring if I found it breathtaking, she'd be blown away. We drove out to Patapsco, found a free campsite, and after setting up, we crossed the train tracks and headed for the river. About 10 to 15 minutes into the hike, my girlfriend was loving the scenery and taking pictures on her phone. Suddenly, we heard voices from across the water. The river isn't very wide, but since it was summer, the trees and bushes were in full bloom, so we couldn't see who was speaking. Then, out of nowhere, someone burst through the bushes on the other side of the river and ran into the water. They looked terrified, and while running, they tripped and fell hard into the water. I was about to run up the bank to offer help, but just as I was about to move, the person stood up, turned around, and screamed, "No, please, no!" And then we heard 3 loud gunshots, bang, bang, bang. The man fell backward into the river again. It all happened in just a few seconds. The voices, the man falling, standing up, and then being shot. But I swear, he hadn't even hit the water again before my girlfriend and I took off running. In an instant, our peaceful day turned into a nightmare. It was a complete 180, and not just in terms of the direction we ran. One moment, I was the happiest I'd been in months, and the next, we were literally running for our lives. Even though we weren't the targets, I figured anyone willing to shoot someone in broad daylight wouldn't want witnesses. What haunts me most is how I didn't run as fast as I could have. The whole time we were running, I was trying to keep myself between my girlfriend and the shooter. I kept thinking, if someone's going to get shot, I want it to be me, not her. It wasn't about being a hero, it was just instinct. Still, the feeling was terrifying, slowing myself down when I desperately wanted to sprint, all while hoping I wouldn't get hit, or worse, that if I did, the bullet wouldn't pass through me and hit her too. She was incredible. Ran like the wind, stayed silent, and didn't slow down until we were safely back across the train tracks. Without a doubt, those few minutes were the most terrifying of my life. If I had been alone or with a friend, it would have been scary enough. But with my girlfriend there, it was even worse. There's this natural urge to protect the people you care about, but deep down, I knew that if the shooter came after us, there wasn't much I could do. The best I could manage was to act as a shield, and I'm proud I did, but it was still a horrifying experience. We managed to get out safely and called the police as soon as we could. I don't know what happened to the person who got shot, and as far as I know, their killer has never been caught. A few summers ago, my boyfriend and I went on a camping trip to Tennessee. The first couple of days were really nice. Late one afternoon, while we were grilling dinner, we heard someone yelling for help. The sound came from a nearby campsite, close enough for us to hear but out of sight. My boyfriend and I rushed over, only to be met with a scene that felt like it was straight out of a horror film. There was a guy slumped against a picnic table, with a deep cut across his stomach. Apparently, he had been walking around with a knife in his hand, tripped, and accidentally stabbed himself badly. He was bleeding a lot. We quickly laid him down, and my boyfriend tried to stop the bleeding by pressing on the wound. I grabbed my phone to call for help, but I couldn't get any signal. The nearest hospital was about 20 miles away, so even if we had service, it would take a while for help to arrive. That's when my boyfriend asked the guy where his truck keys were. The guy told us, so I went to get them. Within moments, we were loading him into the back of his truck and speeding off towards the nearest hospital. What made the whole thing even more terrifying for me personally was that we were both covered in his blood. Blood has always made me feel faint. I once cut my hand, ran it under water, and passed out. So, with my history, there was no way I could be in the back of the truck with him. I knew I would pass out, and with the guy potentially dying back there, 2 funerals might have been in the cards. I had to drive while my boyfriend stayed in the back, keeping pressure on the guy's wound. I tried telling my boyfriend I might faint at the wheel, but he insisted I focus on driving. He said I should pull over if I started feeling lightheaded, but adrenaline must have kicked in because we made it to the hospital in 12 minutes. My boyfriend later told me that we arrived just as the guy started slurring his words, which was obviously a bad sign. If we had taken any longer, he might not have stayed conscious. When we got to the hospital, the staff pulled him out of the truck, and I remember seeing a huge pool of blood underneath him. My boyfriend's pants were soaked. Once the guy was safely handed over to the medical team, we drove his truck back to the campsite. That night, we were left to watch his dog, trying to return to some normalcy, though it was impossible after what had happened. The next morning, the man's brother came to pick up his things. Thankfully, he told us that his brother had survived and was going to be fine. It was an emotional moment. If you've ever had someone thank you for saving a loved one's life, you know how overwhelming it can be. We all had lumps in our throats as we helped pack up the man's belongings and wished his brother the best. Though the whole ordeal was terrifying, we had a happy ending. Not only did we save a life, but the experience also brought me and my now husband closer together. It's a memory that will stay with us forever.